Now I want to show you, based on all these constraints that we have looked at together, how a system such as a membership management or a fundraising management software, or a CRM, or actually any collaborative database, can help you to make things easier for you and your organization, and what you need to put into place. So to achieve this, we would strongly recommend you, obviously, to establish a referral on your accounts. We'll recommend you to centralize all of your data, eventually to set up interfaces which will allow you to gather data from a centralized database, such as sensitive or personal data, for instance, to potentially set up workflows and automations which will help you to manage GDPR constraints. Again, however, I mean, I've mentioned it before, but this will really depend and vary on the amounts of the points of contact that you have with one member or donor or your prospect. It will depend on the number of solutions of software that are using the information, and finally, it will depend on the volume of contacts that you have with your contacts. Clearly, if you have one unique database, one website with one form, if you have, I don't know, 300 or less members, and that you only have one interaction per month with your contacts, maybe it's not relevant to put into places workflows, automations, and so on. However, obviously, if you have different websites, if you're using, let's say, mobile apps, different applications gathering and using and treating the personal data, that you're dealing with high volumes of information, and that actually, therefore, you're being more and more exposed to higher risk regarding GDPR regulation, obviously, it is highly recommended to put into place the necessary measures. In the event that you didn't have a referral, a centralized database, or interfaces, especially in the last case that I mentioned, if you're still using Excel spreadsheets for your prospection, if you're using mailing lists on Outlook, quotes that you maintain on a hard drive, and that you manage, I don't know, subscriptions via the back office of your website, for instance, if you don't have this level of centralization, I'm sure you can easily imagine the amount of work and the difficulties and hence the risk you will face if ever one of your contacts required to be deleted from your listings, as you will have to amend your mailing list, your spreadsheets, and so on. So you can actually see here how it can quickly become hard to remain compliant, especially when you're using and dealing important volumes of personal data. In that context, the risk is that to remain GDPR compliant, you'll have to divert your collaborators from their initial missions, as they will spend a lot more time to process requests due to an appropriate IT structure, as there's no centralized database, no referral. They will eventually not be able to process requests. They'll potentially delete the contact from a contact list, but obviously this contact will remain on someone else's list, and so on. And therefore, you're going to expose your organization to risk, to sanctions, and to fines. So what is the appropriate architecture for an organization with several software using personal data and dealing with those high volumes of data? You'll need a shared repository of contacts. You actually usually find this as in a CRM. And this should be interfaced with all the different systems that you're going to be using. So it could be either Outlook, it could be emailing platforms, accounting softwares, potentially other databases that other countries or different branches are using. It could be with an ERP system, with different websites, different extranets, and so on. Obviously, in that case, so of high volumes of interactions, of personal data, and several systems in use, in that case, you'll need to update the information in your CRM. There's different ways to do this. You'll have, obviously, you can do either this manually, but you can also put into place interfaces via an API, via XML feeds, or schedule tasks. This obviously implies a duplicate management feature because you could amend a record on one of the systems and not on all of them, and therefore put your organization at risk. You must also put in place sufficient security measures, and that in order to limit your exposure to risks, sanctions, and fines. These measures are the following. Is your data hosted in a secured place? Is the access of the database secured with a login and a password? Are the communication servers locked? Is the data transiting SSL encrypted? Do you have a daily backup? Are they replicated on backup servers and remote sites? How long are they maintained for? Is there a server monitoring? Is there no data? Are you sure there's no data on hard drives or mobiles? All of these are necessary, obviously, to be compliant with the new regulation. Here, for most of the small and medium organizations, cloud-based solutions are a good way to fill in these requirements without having to invest too much money. When talking about data centralization, we can see that when we don't have this 360 view of all the interaction that you've had with the contact, when you don't have a clear visibility of the information that you've gathered, you are putting your organization at risk because you'll not be able to process the data correctly. You're also putting your organization at risk, and I've actually mentioned this before, if you don't have a duplicate management tool. So, for instance, I should have a preventive deduplication feature to make sure that the contact does not already exist in the database. If not, obviously, I will create a duplicate, and I could, again, put myself or my organization at risk with the future interactions I might have with this particular contact. I should also have, and you can see on the right, the possibility to identify existing duplicates. And for instance, on the right, you can see here, I have the possibility to choose the information that I want to keep when I'm going to merge my records. When processing high volumes of information, I can also use tools to identify duplicates and obviously mass process them, as you can see on our application here with the multiple deduplication module, where you can actually able to choose the deduplication criteria. You can define the automations that you're going to need. You can define the priorities and define the mass processing to specific targets, such as, let's say, all the contacts that you haven't updated for a certain amount of time. You can decide to prioritize on just your members or just your donors and so on. Then you will have access to different monitoring tools. Without these tools, it's actually going to be difficult for you to figure out where you're standing with let's say the fill rate of your information, to figure out how recent the data at your disposal is, to keep track of your record of processing activities, and obviously of the different requests made. These monitoring tools will help you to manage the regulations requirements and will also be helpful to identify those priorities for action. You'll also have the subject of the user rights and the access to confidential information. Here again, the tools you should use should allow you to administrate, parameter, and really set these security measures. So here, for instance, I can display restrictions to specific user groups, or I can also define different password strategies and so on. I'm going to be able to put session length when I'm leaving my computer, for instance, put authorizations to specific IP addresses. You can also put into place different level of rights, as I was saying, by managing groups of users, and obviously appoint rights to one user, one group, and so on. You should be able to set and to manage on each module, each table, and actually each field behavior such as conditional modification, you can see on the right here, deletion conditions, visibility conditions, modification conditions, and so on. And finally, be able to administrate these rights by allowing users or groups of users to visualize, to modify, to delete specific information. This will actually allow me for this example. For instance, here I can see that I'm connected as the user Susan. Here I can actually visualize Mr. Smith's insurance number. However, you can see that when I'm logged in as the user William, I actually do not have access to that particular piece of information. You also have data retention management tools, as we have seen previously, that you will need to deal with different periods of data retention. Remember the 3 years of data retention. You're then going to be able to create filters taking into account all of the interactions that you've had with your contact, and which will take you into account whether the contact has responded to the interaction. So, for example, as he accepted a meeting with you, has the contact been modified in the last few weeks or months? Has the recipient accepted an invitation to an event? Has he, I don't know, clicked on any links that you've sent through newsletters? So basically, all the information that will allow you to figure out if yes or no I'm dealing with a prospect that I wish to and that I can keep in my database. From here, you'll be able to do mass processing on, let's say, all the contacts that have not been updated for the past 2 years, for example. And obviously, instead of deleting them from your database, you can just decide to anonymize them, as you can see on the screenshot here, which will then give me the ability, in terms of obviously statistics and reporting, to keep a coherent data set in regards of my strategy. You can see that by digging deeper in the elements that you may have at your disposal, you're going to be able to set automations on the duration of data retention, for example. So here I'm going to be able to decide to archive records which haven't been modified for a specific period of time. I'm going to be able to delete the information or a record after a certain period of time with no modification, with no interaction, or potentially after a certain date. I can also put into place, as I mentioned, anonymization rules for records with whom no interactions have been made for let's say over 3 years. So I can really go a lot deeper in the automation of the treatment of my database in regards to this new GDPR regulation. And really, I think that this shows that depending on your context, obviously on the volume and the nature of information that you're dealing with, you can adapt and put into place more or less automations to help you manage your data. You'll also be able to log all the different interactions that you've had with the contact. So here, for instance, you can see that Mr. Smith has signed a quote. He's actually clicked on a link. He's done an online request. Here, that he's actually attended to a meeting. So all of this information actually justifies the fact that I can actually keep this particular contact in my database. To conclude, and actually to resume what GDPR is going to change and what it's going to mean for your organization, well, what we've seen today is that the new regulation is actually going to put your member database, your donor database, your user database, your customer database, and so on, whatever sector you're in, it's going to put it at the heart of your organization. We also know that the quality, obviously, of the database is essential for the efficiency and the motivation of your collaborators. So whether it is spending time trying to call the wrong numbers, whether it's receiving failed delivery emails, spending time to process contact requests with half the information missing. As soon as your database does not help your teams to deliver, you're actually exposing your organization to risks. Obviously, there's decreasing the impact of turnover or reorganizations. I'm sure that you've experienced this before. When a collaborator leaves or changes a department, obviously different records, different contacts, different customers, different clients are going to be redistributed to other collaborators. You can obviously easily imagine that with a high-quality database, the history is taken into account, and you've minimized obviously the risk to expose the organization by not respecting the rights and the decisions of your contacts. Forecast reliability. You can spend a lot of time producing provisions instead of actually analyzing them. An up-to-date and a qualified database will allow you to actually spend more time on analyzing, on actually exploiting these analysis. Then obviously profitability and of operational marketing. Of course, as you may know, that actually your organization can be scored depending on the deliverability of emails. Poor deliverability might actually resume in your organization being more and more blacklisted and so on. So it can have a huge impact on that. And of course, the image reflected, it will have a positive impact on the image that your organization will give. If you actually communicate on your security measures, if you're reactive to your contact requests, obviously the outcome will be positive for your organization. Then data is the main component of the continuity of your organization, and actually more globally, it's one of the main key factors of success. So being able to rely on clean and usable data is extremely important. And finally, I would say that GDPR is a great way to mobilize your organization around its resources. And obviously a strong database orientated on your members, on your donors, will help you to steer these resources in the most efficient way. We know for a fact that the IT infrastructures, the database projects are usually the sector where NFPs try to save the most money, when they try to spend the less time, where they tend to move the later to. But really, by taking into consideration the impact of this new GDPR regulation, and also thinking about all the opportunities that can be actually seized by putting the right actions into place, I really believe it is actually really worth investing into a coherent system.